They applauded when he finished his opening remarks. What they didn't know was that every word had been mine until 3 months ago. I stood near the refreshment table at the Riverside Philosophy Society's annual gala, watching Graham accept compliments from people who believed he was the intellectual force behind their book club's success. The event was held in the conservatory of the Preston estate, all glass ceilings and hanging gardens, with 200 guests who'd paid $150 each to celebrate a year of what they called rigorous philosophical discourse. Graham wore the navy suit I'd helped him pick out, the one that made him look professorial without trying too hard. He held a glass of champagne and nodded thoughtfully as Patricia Chen, a retired literature professor, praised his analysis of Kierkegaard from last month's discussion. I knew he had no idea what she was actually talking about because I'd stopped writing his discussion guides in January, and everything he'd said about Kierkegaard had been improvised nonsense he'd cobbled together from internet summaries. But Patricia didn't know that. None of them did. Yet. The Riverside Philosophy Society had been Graham's idea 5 years ago, back when we'd first moved to this wealthy Connecticut suburb for his job in corporate consulting. He'd wanted to seem cultured, connected, intellectually serious in a way that would impress his colleagues and their wives. The problem was that Graham hadn't read philosophy since a required course in college, and even then he'd barely passed. But he had me. I'd gotten my master's in philosophy from Columbia, had written my thesis on phenomenology and embodied cognition, had spent years actually engaging with the texts he wanted to seem knowledgeable about. When he'd proposed starting a book club focused on classic philosophical works, I'd been excited. I thought we'd be running it together, that this would be something we could share. Instead, Graham positioned himself as the founder and primary facilitator while introducing me to members as his wife who'd studied philosophy, a detail mentioned once, then forgotten. He wanted the intellectual credibility without sharing the spotlight, and I'd given it to him because I'd loved him and wanted him to succeed. It started small. Graham would ask me to recommend books for the club to read, and I'd suggest texts I knew well: Camus, Sartre, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Hannah Arendt. Then he'd ask me to help him prepare discussion questions, just to make sure he hit the important themes. I'd spend hours crafting questions that would guide the conversation through complex ideas, breaking down difficult concepts into accessible entry points, anticipating where the discussion might stall, and providing follow-up prompts. Graham would use them exactly as I'd written them, and the club members would marvel at his ability to facilitate such deep conversations. Then he started asking me to read passages and explain them to him the night before meetings, saying he wanted to make sure he understood the nuances. I'd essentially teach him the material, walking him through arguments and counter-arguments, providing historical context, and connecting ideas across different philosophers. He'd absorb what I told him, regurgitate it at the meetings with slight variations in phrasing, and accept praise for insights that had come entirely from my analysis. The club grew from 8 people meeting in our living room to 43 members renting space at the Community Arts Center. Graham's reputation as a philosophical thinker spread through our social circle. He was invited to speak at the library's lecture series, asked to contribute essays to the local cultural magazine, introduced at dinner parties as the man who'd brought serious intellectual discourse to Riverside. People quoted his interpretations of texts at cocktail parties. Someone started a waiting list for club membership because they'd heard Graham's discussions were transformative. He'd become a minor local celebrity in our educated, upper-middle-class bubble, and everything that made him impressive had come from me. I'd written every discussion question, prepared every thematic framework, created every analytical lens he'd used to interpret texts. Without my preparation, Graham couldn't tell you the difference between deontological and consequentialist ethics. couldn't explain Hegel's dialectic if his life depended on it, couldn't identify the central argument in any of the books his club had supposedly studied deeply. For 4.5 years, I'd enabled his performance. I'd told myself it was fine, that we were a team, that his success reflected well on both of us, even if no one knew about my contribution. But things had shifted last fall when I'd tried to get more involved publicly. The club was reading Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and I'd mentioned to Graham that I'd love to co-facilitate that discussion given my background in feminist philosophy. He'd said it would seem weird for me to suddenly step in, that members were used to his facilitation style, that having two voices might confuse the format. I'd pushed back, said this was literally my area of expertise, that I could provide perspectives he couldn't. Graham had gotten defensive. He'd said the club was his project. His professional reputation was built on it, and having his wife suddenly take over would make him look incompetent, like he needed rescue. He'd asked me to just prepare the materials like always and let him present them. He'd promised we could discuss co-facilitation in the future, maybe starting next year. I'd agreed because I'd wanted to avoid a fight, but something had cracked in me during that conversation. I'd realized Graham didn't see me as a collaborator. He saw me as a resource to be used privately and erased publicly. I'd stopped helping him on January 3rd. No dramatic announcement, no confrontation. I'd simply told Graham I was getting busy with my own projects and wouldn't have time to prepare his discussion materials anymore. He'd laughed it off initially, said he'd been doing this long enough that he could probably manage on his own now, that I'd taught him how to analyze these texts. I hadn't argued. I'd just stopped sending him annotated reading guides, stopped explaining passages the night before meetings, stopped crafting his discussion questions. The first book on the spring schedule was Heidegger's Being and Time, notoriously one of the most difficult texts in Western philosophy. Graham had 3 weeks to prepare. I'd watched him carry the book around the house, highlighting random passages, taking notes that made no coherent sense. He'd tried to read secondary sources but couldn't follow the academic language without my translation. He'd asked me a few casual questions, clearly fishing for help, and I'd given vague responses. "That's interesting. What do you think it means?" Or, "I'd have to reread that section to remember." He'd looked frustrated but hadn't directly asked me to prepare materials like before. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit he needed me that explicitly. The Heidegger discussion had been a disaster. I'd heard about it from Lydia Park, one of the club members who worked at the same hospital where I did consulting for their ethics board. She'd stopped by my office looking confused, asking if Graham was feeling okay, because the discussion had been weirdly superficial. She said he'd spent most of the 2 hours asking the group what they thought various passages meant instead of offering any framework for interpretation. She said someone had brought up Dasein, and Graham had clearly not understood the question, had deflected by saying that was an interesting observation and moving on. She said it had felt more like a college student leading a class unprepared than the usual sophisticated analysis the club expected. I'd made sympathetic noises and said Graham had been stressed at work lately, that maybe he'd just had an off night. Lydia had seemed relieved to have an explanation and didn't push further. But it wasn't an off night. The next month, they'd read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and Graham had again failed to provide meaningful guidance. Then Judith Butler, which he'd completely misinterpreted, focusing on random quotes he'd pulled without understanding their theoretical context. Then Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, where he'd apparently contradicted himself multiple times and couldn't answer basic questions about resentment. Club members had started noticing a pattern. The facilitator they'd trusted to guide them through complex ideas was suddenly unable to do so. Some members had started bringing their own research to discussions, essentially teaching each other, while Graham nodded along like he'd intended the conversation to go that direction. Others had started skipping meetings. The waiting list had disappeared. 2 members had quietly asked me, during separate social encounters, whether I thought Graham might benefit from taking a break from facilitation, maybe bringing in guest speakers for a while. The intellectual foundation of his local reputation was crumbling, and he had no idea how to stop it because he'd never actually built it himself. Graham had tried to get me to help him again. He'd started asking direct questions about the books, seeking my insights in ways he'd framed as casual conversation, but were clearly desperate attempts to gather material for discussions. I'd stayed vague. He'd asked me to just glance at his discussion questions before meetings, give him quick feedback. I'd been too busy. He'd finally confronted me directly about 3 weeks before the gala, accused me of sabotaging him by withdrawing my support, said I was being petty and vindictive. I'd asked him what support he meant, since the club was his project and he'd always presented himself as the philosophical expert. He'd gotten flustered, said I knew exactly what he meant, that I'd always helped him prepare, and suddenly stopping was deliberately making him look incompetent. I told him the truth quietly. I'd said if my absence made him look incompetent, perhaps that was because the competence had been mine all along, and he'd been performing knowledge he'd never actually possessed. Graham had stared at me like I'd slapped him. Then he'd gotten angry, said I was exaggerating my contributions, that he'd learned from me but he'd done the actual intellectual work of facilitation, that preparing questions wasn't the same as leading discussions. I'd let him believe that. I hadn't told him about the documentation I'd been keeping, because I'd saved everything. Every discussion guide I'd written, saved with timestamps. Every email where I'd send Graham analysis of passages with specific interpretations that he'd later presented as his own insights. Every text message where he'd asked me to explain concepts that he'd claimed to understand thoroughly during meetings. 4.5 years of evidence showing exactly how much of his intellectual performance had been my work. I'd backed it all up to a separate cloud account in January, organized chronologically with corresponding dates of club meetings where that material had been used. I'd done this not because I'd planned to expose him, but because I'd wanted proof for myself that I wasn't crazy, that my contributions had been substantial and real. But as the gala approached, and I'd watched Graham continue to accept credit for philosophical sophistication he'd never possessed, I'd realized the evidence had another purpose. The annual gala was the Riverside Philosophy Society's biggest event, a celebration where Graham typically gave an opening speech about the year's intellectual journey and announced the next year's reading list. It was attended not just by club members, but by their spouses, local academics, donors who supported the Arts Center, reporters from the community newspaper. This year's theme was The Examined Life, with Socratic irony that I'd found almost too perfect. Graham had written and rewritten his speech a dozen times, shown me drafts asking for feedback I'd politely declined to give. He'd settled on something about the transformative power of sustained engagement with difficult texts, about how philosophy taught us to question our assumptions and seek truth beneath surface appearances. He'd planned to announce next year's ambitious reading list, works by Kant and Hegel that I knew he couldn't possibly facilitate without my help. The speech was scheduled for 7:30, after cocktail hour and before dinner. I'd arrived at the gala alone, telling Graham I'd meet him there because I had an errand to run. The errand had been stopping at a print shop to pick up materials I'd prepared. I'd worn a dress Graham had always said was too academic for social events, black and simple, with a structured cut that made me look professorial. I'd carried a leather portfolio that matched. When Graham had seen me arrive, he'd looked annoyed that I wasn't by his side for the cocktail hour schmoozing, but he'd been too busy accepting compliments to make an issue with it. I'd watched him work the room, watched him nod sagely when someone mentioned philosophical concepts, watched him deflect specific questions by saying that was exactly the kind of inquiry the club explored together. Patricia Chen had cornered him at one point with a detailed question about phenomenological reduction, and I'd seen panic flash across his face before he'd excused himself to greet a new arrival. At 7:30, the event coordinator called everyone to attention. Graham took his position at the small podium that had been set up near the fountain, microphone in hand. He'd started his speech with a quote from Socrates about the unexamined life not being worth living, then moved into reflections on the past year's discussions. He'd talked about the challenges of engaging with Heidegger, the insights gained from Foucault, the transformative conversations around Butler and Nietzsche. He'd made it all sound coherent, like the discussions had been sophisticated and successful rather than the confused sessions they'd actually become without my preparation. People had nodded along, remembering the year fondly perhaps because they'd filled in Graham's gaps with their own learning. He'd been building toward the announcement of next year's reading list when I'd stepped forward from the crowd. I'd asked if I could add something to his remarks. Graham had looked startled but had agreed with a strained smile, probably assuming I was going to offer some supportive comment about the club's success. I'd walked to the podium, set my portfolio down, and opened it to reveal the printed materials I'd brought. I'd thanked Graham for his introduction, then told the assembled guests there was something they should know about the Riverside Philosophy Society's intellectual foundation. I'd explained calmly that for 4.5 years, I'd written every discussion question, prepared every analytical framework, created every thematic guide that had made the club's conversations possible. I'd said that Graham's reputation as a philosophical facilitator had been built entirely on my work I'd done privately and which he'd presented publicly as his own insights. I'd told them about my master's degree in philosophy, my thesis work, my actual expertise in the field that Graham had borrowed without acknowledgement. Then I'd distributed copies of my evidence to the tables closest to the podium. The packets contained side-by-side comparisons. On one side, my emails and documents with timestamps showing discussion questions and analytical frameworks I'd created. On the other side, transcripts and notes from club meetings where Graham had used that exact material, often word for word, presented as his own preparation and insight. I'd included examples from discussions of Camus, Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Arendt. I'd shown emails where Graham had asked me to explain concepts like bad faith, the banality of evil, and existential freedom, followed by meeting notes where he'd presented those explanations as his own understanding. I'd included text messages from the night before difficult discussions where he'd asked me what key passages meant, followed by his facilitation the next day, where he'd confidently interpreted those same passages using my exact language. The documentation was comprehensive and damning. It showed beyond any reasonable doubt that Graham had been performing knowledge he'd never possessed, crediting himself for intellectual work I'd done in private. The room had gone completely silent. People were reading the packets I'd distributed, passing them to neighboring tables. Patricia Chen was staring at Graham with an expression of profound disappointment. Lydia Park had her hand over her mouth, looking shocked. Graham's face had gone from red to white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He'd tried to speak, to say something about how I was exaggerating, how married couples collaborated all the time, how this was a misunderstanding. I'd let him stumble through a few sentences, then I'd asked him a simple question. I'd asked him to explain, right now, without preparation, what Heidegger meant by being toward death, a concept central to the text they'd supposedly studied in such depth in January. Graham had stared at me, panicked. He'd started to answer with something vague about mortality and authenticity, generic things you'd find in the first paragraph of any Wikipedia entry. Patricia had interrupted him. She'd said she'd asked him about that exact concept during the Heidegger discussion, and he'd deflected the question, and now she understood why. She'd said she'd been in graduate seminars where students tried to fake their way through discussions of texts they hadn't read, and Graham's recent facilitation had reminded her of exactly that kind of unprepared performance. Others had started speaking up. A man named Richard Torres, a high school philosophy teacher, said he'd noticed the dramatic decline in discussion quality after January and had assumed Graham was dealing with personal issues, but now he understood what had actually changed. Someone else mentioned they'd found it strange that Graham had seemed unable to answer specific questions about texts he'd supposedly studied carefully. A woman I didn't know well said she'd been ready to quit the club because recent discussions had felt pointless, and now she knew why the intellectual rigor had disappeared. Graham had tried again to defend himself, saying I was angry about something unrelated and using the club to humiliate him publicly, that this was a private marital issue being weaponized. I'd responded calmly that intellectual fraud wasn't a private marital issue when it had been used to build a public reputation, that every person in this room had paid money and invested time believing they were engaging with someone who possessed philosophical expertise, and they deserved to know that expertise had been borrowed without acknowledgement or understanding. The event coordinator had suggested we move to dinner, clearly trying to diffuse the situation, but no one had moved toward the tables. The gala had effectively ended in that moment because no one wanted to sit through a celebratory dinner after watching the guest of honor exposed as a fraud. Patricia had approached me quietly, said she was sorry she hadn't realized what was happening, that she'd assumed Graham's recent struggles were temporary, rather than revealing of a fundamental deception. She'd asked if I'd be interested in actually leading discussions next year, said the club needed someone with genuine expertise if it was going to continue. Others had gathered around making similar comments, offering support, expressing anger at Graham for misleading them. Lydia had hugged me, whispered that what I'd done took courage, that Graham had used my work and my silence to build something that had never been his. Graham had stood alone at the podium, still holding his prepared speech about next year's reading list, watching his intellectual reputation disintegrate in real time. I'd left the gala before dinner was served, walked to my car in the parking lot while the sky turned purple and gold over the conservatory's glass ceiling. I'd felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd destroyed Graham publicly, but because I'd finally stopped carrying his performance on my back. The next day, Graham had moved out of our house and stayed with a friend, unable to face me after what he called my betrayal. The club had sent an email to all members explaining that Graham would be stepping down from facilitation immediately, that they'd be restructuring with new leadership, that they appreciated everyone's patience during the transition. 3 members had reached out asking if I'd consider taking over. I'd said I'd think about it, that I needed time to decide if I wanted to be part of something that had been built on my erased labor, even if that erasure was being corrected now. I'd filed for separation 2 weeks after the gala. Graham had tried to salvage things, said he'd been wrong to take credit for my work, that he'd make it right somehow, that we could start over. But I'd realized the problem wasn't just about the book club. It was about a pattern where Graham had needed me to provide substance while he collected credit, where my intelligence and work had been resources for him to mine privately while maintaining a public image that excluded my contribution. The book club had been the most visible example, but it had extended to his career, our social life, every space where being seen as smart and cultured had mattered to him. He'd wanted the rewards of intellectual engagement without doing the actual work, and he'd built our entire marriage around my willingness to be his hidden engine. Stopping my help with the club had revealed what had always been true. Without me, Graham's performance collapsed because there was nothing underneath it. I'd started leading a small philosophy discussion group of my own, meeting weekly at the library with 8 people who wanted genuine engagement with texts rather than social performance. We'd read Iris Murdoch and Martha Nussbaum and contemporary philosophers working on applied ethics. I'd facilitated discussions using my actual expertise, my years of training, my passion for these ideas that had been reduced to props for someone else's reputation. I'd started leading a small philosophy discussion group of my own, meeting weekly at the library with 8 people who wanted genuine engagement with texts rather than social performance. We'd read Iris Murdoch and Martha Nussbaum and contemporary philosophers working on applied ethics. I'd facilitated discussions using my actual expertise, my years of training, my passion for these ideas that had been reduced to props for someone else's reputation. Patricia had joined the group, and Lydia, and several others from the original club who said they'd missed having a facilitator who actually knew what they were talking about. We'd kept it small deliberately, focused on depth rather than growth, on learning rather than appearing learned. No one asked me to prepare materials in secret or hide my contributions so someone else could seem brilliant. My insights were mine publicly, and that had felt radical after years of watching Graham accept credit for every thought I'd ever explained to him. Graham's reputation in our social circle had never recovered. The story of the gala had spread because too many people had witnessed it, had seen the evidence, had shared their own experiences of noticing his incompetence once my support disappeared. He'd become known as the man who'd faked his way through leading a philosophy club using his wife's expertise, and that label had followed him to dinner parties and networking events and anywhere our overlapping social worlds intersected. He'd tried to rebuild by being honest about his limitations, admitting he'd made mistakes, but the trust was gone. People didn't want to engage with someone who'd proven willing to lie about the source of his knowledge for years. He'd eventually taken a job in a different city, moved away from Riverside and the community that had seen him exposed, started over somewhere his past wasn't common knowledge. I'd stayed in our house after the divorce finalized, the same house where the book club had started in our living room 5 years ago. Sometimes I'd sit in that living room and remember the early meetings, when I'd believed Graham and I were building something together, when I'd thought my contributions mattered even if they weren't publicly acknowledged. I'd been so wrong about what partnership meant, had confused his willingness to use my work with shared purpose, had accepted invisibility as the price of his success. The gala hadn't been about revenge or public humiliation. It had been about refusing to disappear anymore, about insisting that my work carry my name, about standing in front of 200 people and saying clearly that intellectual labor had a source, and that source deserved recognition. I'd finally stopped helping Graham perform knowledge he didn't have, and in doing so, I'd discovered I'd never needed him to validate my expertise. It had been mine all along, and now everyone knew exactly whose insights had made those discussions possible.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.